Hi, it's Mindrolling. Raghu's back with the original manifestor of Mindrolling, David Silver. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Raghu. Good to be here in the Mindrolling salon.
Yes, glad to have you. I'm managing to catch David every once in a while, yeah, one day we'll talk about this other project that you're doing. That's going to be quite a great thing aside from the book. So, I mean, this came up happenstance, really. It was all
Right.
about, hey, let's do something. And of course, on our minds on a day-to-day basis is what I call the gigantic sea change that happened over the new year, and into it now we are, going on 4 months. And David just thought, oh, you know what? I just happened to see a bunch of different writings of Thich Nhat Hanh teachings. And I thought, what better thing to do to share with everybody out there, because talk about a man of peace, mindfulness, awareness. I mean, he is the epitome of it. And what do you want to talk a little bit about how you first ran into even knowing about Thich Nhat Hanh and any other experiential thing about him?
Well,
and who he is.
You know, he's a great monk from Thailand, right? And
Vietnam.
He was known. Vietnam. Sorry, bad mistake. He walked the killing fields not in Cambodia, but in Vietnam, where there were just nothing but bodies around him, and led monks through these killing fields, and started his teaching of trying to deal with enormous adversity. Most of us have never experienced anything close to this. Vietnam was a genocide, as we know, now revised in history as a great American hero platform, but it wasn't. It was a genocide. And 55,000 Americans died, and millions, 2.5 million of Cambodians and Vietnamese died for no reason whatsoever. People now go surfing in communist Vietnam. So he emerged from that, and Martin Luther King, Dr. King, when Thich Nhat Hanh was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, said that there was no one on earth that deserved it more than him. And coming from Dr. King, that means a lot to me. And that's just sort of way back. Now he's much older, obviously, and has gone through a lot of illness and so forth, but still with us, thank God.
Yes, almost died of a stroke just recently in the last couple of years, is still recovering. Right.
So when Raghu and I talked preliminarily a few days ago about doing this podcast, I happened to be looking at some of his some of Thich Nhat Hanh's writings, and it seemed very appropriate that we should talk about him in this time of incredible turmoil and violence and lies and chicanery and corruption, and just about the worst thing I've experienced since I've been on this planet, which is a long time, which is the ascension to the American presidency of a bunch of scoundrels and liars. And we don't know what they're going to do. We saw them do a fruitless and pointless attack upon Syria. They attacked an airfield, which is supposed to be the airfield where the chemical attack, the dreadful chemical attack was launched. And now I found out on CNN this morning that airplanes are taking off from that same airport. In other words, they did nothing. Zero. They didn't even destroy the runways, which is the thing that always happens when you attack airfields, is you destroy the runways so the planes can't take off. But they're taking off. And it's just not just the violence and the horror of the children that were killed, and 400,000 Syrians have died so far in this war. And we've done nothing. And those that say that Obama did nothing should remember that Obama tried to do something and was voted down by the Republican Congress. He wanted to do strikes at one point, and the Republicans, our great heroes, voted him down. So the hypocrites are now are accusing, in Trump's speech when he, from his palace said that he ordered this strike, he immediately, instead of talking about the children or the horrors of this, he immediately launched into a diatribe about Obama, which shows you how much he really felt about this. So this awful scenario that we're in, it couldn't be worse apart from a nuclear war, which is not impossible to imagine at this point. How do we deal with this as people who are living comfortable lives in the United States or elsewhere? How do we deal with this as simultaneously happening, where not only is the world in terrible turmoil and awful stuff is going on in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in North Korea, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, all over, in South Sudan, where there's enormous starvation at this time, the worst starvation of our entire lives. Well, how do we deal with this? Apart from being activists and helping, how do we put ourselves into a state where we are strong and poised and have equanimity and no rage, although you can hear it in my voice, I'm sure. How do we do that? And it seems to me that this amazing Vietnamese teacher is one of those conduits to strengthening ourselves, along with many, many, many other teachers. Ram Dass has been particularly incredible in his writings recently on your website, Raghu, on Love Serve Remember website. He's done many and emails to us all about how to deal with this, and he's certainly not saying we should just meditate and play with our beads and eat granola. He's been saying there is a way to be activist without being enraged, and I think Raghu and I are about to talk about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Something like that.
Yeah. Now, before we even get into it, I think everything that you've said qualifies as under the basic suffering moniker, right? There's a lot of suffering going on, and from your point of view and mine, this change of administration is a cause of deep pain and suffering. Looking out at, from our point of view, the kinds of things that are being done that just, to say the very least, are negative for people who have no means, for people of different races and colors, and we can go on and on. So that's real suffering for us and real reactivity within ourselves. As you heard David admit, you can hear the tone in his voice, and if I went on, you'd hear the tone in mine, I'm sure. But I want to include people who did feel that Trump was going to change something in their lives in this suffering, because either they feel they are continuing to be marginalized by intellectuals, they are continuing to not be able to gain work, have gainful employment in the areas that they are in as a result of policies that interfered with freer trade, with less regulations, and so on. And they truly believe that this that was a cause of suffering for them, and now perhaps one feels that there's a further cause for suffering, in that maybe some of these promises they're hoping that did get put into effect by Trump and the administration may not. So I think that there's suffering on both sides of the polarization that we have in this country, and I think that we want to address it. Obviously, we've made no bones about our own affiliation in terms of liberalism versus conservatism, if you just leave it at that, in that regard, that boundary. But I think what Thich Nhat Hanh has to offer is a real prescription for dealing with just what we're talking about, for dealing with suffering, for dealing with how do we get free of the tremendously negative emotions that we all have, And of course, and Ram Dass is one who has espoused this forever. It is very difficult to do any kind of social action, social justice, if we walk around with this rage, as David just pointed out. Let's take turns on this. I mean,
all right.
There's this one little piece, and I thought of it because, or just brought it up, because of what you said about how he lived through this horrific war. He was getting bombed, okay? He and his family, he and his people. And he talks about how he engaged Buddhism, is what he called it. We walked mindfully right alongside suffering in the place where people were still running under the bombs. Okay, so I think he's not speaking from any intellectual vantage point. He's speaking from a very experiential vantage point. He said, we created the term engaged Buddhism during the Vietnam War. As monks, nuns, and lay people during the war, many of us practiced sitting and walking meditation. But we would hear the bombs falling around us and the cries of the children and adults who were wounded. To meditate is to be aware of what is going on. What was going on around us was the suffering of many people and the destruction of life. So we were motivated by the desire to do something to relieve the suffering within us and around us. We wanted to serve others, and we wanted to practice sitting and walking meditation to give us the stability and peace we needed to go out of the temple and help relieve this suffering. We walked mindfully right alongside suffering in the places where people were still running under the bombs. We practiced mindful breathing as we cared for children wounded by guns or bombs. If we hadn't practiced while we served, we would have lost ourselves, become burnt out, and not have been able to help anyone. Engaged Buddhism was born from this difficult situation. We wanted to maintain our practice while responding to the suffering around us. Engaged Buddhism isn't just Buddhism that's involved in social problems. Engaged Buddhism means we practice mindfulness wherever we are, whatever we are doing at any time. Engaged Buddhism is Buddhism that penetrates into life. If Buddhism is not engaged, it is not real Buddhism. This is the attitude of the Bodhisattvas, beings whose whole intention and actions are to relieve suffering. We practice meditation and mindfulness not only for ourselves. We practice to relieve the suffering of all beings and of the earth itself, with the insight of interbeing, that we are inherently interconnected with all other beings. We know that when other people suffer less, we suffer less. And when we suffer less, other people suffer less. That seems to be, a few paragraphs that's like an extraordinary container for everything that I know that I have been bringing up on podcasts. And the last time we did a podcast was in the same vein as well, how to deal with this getting ourselves straight and not being angry. And, he calls it engaged Buddhism, but you could call it, engaged spirit, really. I don't think it matters from which religion this engagement springs from. It can, every major religion has within it this same quality of caring and basic need to serve people. So it's when you hear about him doing this with bombs going off around him and so on, and you think about how you just said before, we're living middle-class lives in comfort but we're seeing all this stuff.
Mm.
That for me is a big, what is wrong with us is kind of what I'm saying. What the hell is wrong with us?
Or as Mr. Tuori used to say, what is wrong with your brain?
Yes, my boy.
You're right.
A mentor of ours when we were in India with Maharaji, and he came to visit us in the States. Yeah, so what is wrong with our brains in this case?
It's a difficult question because most of us believe we're not part of the problem. But clearly that isn't true. That our complacency about living our lives with nice furniture and a brand new Range Rover, and even less than that, a TV with Netflix, a garden that you can grow your vegetables, peace, basically, on the most part of this mainland in the United States. So we think it's their fault, be it the Syrian leaders or the ISIS or the Trumpies or whatever. And I think what we're coming to sort of realize is that, and what Thich Nhat Hanh makes clear, is that we're all in this, and there are things that we probably have not done out of our it's almost like being in a guarded community, like when you go to West Palm Beach or Beverly Hills, Carmel, people live in these communities that are gated with guards. And that has, I can understand why people do that, but nevertheless, we're all in one in the United States, because we do not suffer in the way that people are now suffering in Syria. We've seen all the pictures, and we've not really done much. What can we do? And I don't know. I mean, it comes down to this. It doesn't come down to like what your personal environment is. Like, for instance, about 6 months ago, I was actually waiting for a bus in Manhattan, a long queue, and I couldn't get a cab, and it was really driving me crazy. It was hot, and suddenly this man came up to me who was clearly homeless, and he had scanned the whole line. I noticed. I was watching him. He was about 10 feet away, and then he just chose me and came over to me, and he said to me, "Do you remember Vietnam?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Were you there?" I said, "No, I wasn't." He said, "Well, I was." And I was there on several tours, and I saw all kinds of nightmares. It's exactly what he said to me. And then I came home, and I thought it would be okay, and I suddenly found that I was mentally challenged, and I could not function. And in those days, in the late, sort of mid-70s, by the time it was all over, he just couldn't live, and eventually went to the streets. And I was just devastated by this person. Asked him his name. His name was Anthony. I took in my wallet. I had $5 in it. I took out the $5. He said, No, I don't want money from you. I said, "But don't you need to eat?" He said, "No, I don't want the money. I just want to talk to you. You seem like a nice person." And then I started talking. He said, "Oh, you're English. Do you like football?" I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "Do you support a team?" I said, "Yes, I do." We got into a conversation, and it lasted. I missed 2 buses. I just couldn't stop talking to him because he was so intelligent and so sensitive, and clearly was not a hustler who wanted to sort of take my money or anybody else's money. He just wanted to talk. But because of his clothes and sort of a slight smell that was coming off him, he felt terrible about, sort of approaching people. But because I'm obviously a sucker, he approached me and we talked for a long time. And when we finished, I said, "Is there anything I can do for you at all?" He said, No, you did it. You did it. I feel okay now. That was a great conversation. That's all I want. That's all I want is a conversation. No one talks to me. Little slice of suffering from 50 years ago. I might add here that one of my family works with Ken Burns. And Mr. Burns is about to launch his Vietnam documentary. And it's going to be devastating because Ken Burns is an amazing film. As a filmmaker, I have to say that He's just astonishing in his research and depth and integrity. The man is not there to make money or to become famous. He's there to make films about reality as he sees it. And he spent many years doing this Vietnam film. I can't wait for it to come out. And you should all watch out for it. I don't know where it's going to be, probably PBS. But that's 50 years ago. Now we have Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and North Korea and so on and so forth. Yeah. Bad things are happening. How do you not get crazy? How do you remain calm? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh says, as Raghu just quoted, that if you're not at ease in yourself, forget it. You can't help anybody. And if you are, you can help other people and they can help you. And it's a circle that is a really good one. All you can do is what's in your environment to do. It's not like, unless you're with Médecins Sans Frontières or you're with some amazing group of altruistic souls that are out there putting their life on the line. I'm not doing that. And I can't do that. But what you can do is individually try not to hurt anybody, harm anybody, and to improve and ameliorate their condition for however short time you can. And then, as His Holiness has said many times, it's only when you can put your wisdom and stillness into the face of someone else and into their heart that you yourself can be truly happy. So it's sort of, in the end, it's a selfish thing. It's like altruism brings about inner peace, which brings about the truest and deepest happiness. But we're not in this for happiness at this point. We're in this to help people. I mean, what can we do? And the great teachers like Ram Dass and Thich Nhat Hanh and obviously others keep telling us, be still, learn how to meditate, learn how to be mindful of your exact condition, and see meditation as an observation point. You're observing your own rage, your own preoccupations, your own obsessions. And if you can do that enough and do it as a practice, eventually they become less and less and less obtrusive. Particularly, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, if you don't fight them. He says the heart and the mind are not battlefields. We're not at war with ourselves. We should not be. In other words, you have a thought, You're trying to be equanimous, you're trying to meditate, all this stuff is happening, and suddenly you're wondering why the damn Roku won't get Amazon Prime all of a sudden. It comes into my meditation, if not worse things, but, I remember, I've got to watch that film on Amazon, I can't get it working, how can I get it working, who can I call, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, you're meditating, and you're observing. And what Thich Nhat Hanh says in these pieces, don't be at war with yourself, accept these thoughts, love them, and eventually, they too will fade in their power, and you will be clearer and stiller in your self-consciousness. So all of that rap is all about saying we can do what we individually can do.
Well, we've been saying this forever.
Yeah.
It absolutely takes practice to be able to do the kinds of things that are going to open up a new world. And one of the things he talks about is, first of all, you got to recognize that there is a true person inside of you. That's important. And he gives it, there's a little poem I love that he gave from a 13th century, in 13th century Vietnam, King Tran Tai Tung wrote this poem. The true person without position lies on the pile of red flesh. The pink color and the white color of the flesh and of the bones may trick us. Right? What a beautiful way of saying how we are so bound to identify ourselves with thoughts, body sensation, ego, etc. We don't, Thich Nhat Hanh says, we don't recognize our true person. We only live with the things we think are our true person. We live our whole life in this ignorance, thinking our feelings and our flesh are the sum total of our true person. Our true person has no position, right? That's like that, the third Zen patriarch, no preferences too, no position, is not outside or inside, is not tricked by birth and death, by coming and going, by having or not having, by what we do or don't do, whether we play chess, stay in bed all day, or meditate all night. That is not our true person. I love that. So I guess, the primary thing, obviously, is to take a look and see where our perspective is and realize that we are mostly operating on a day-to-day basis from the not true person. And the idea of the practice is to shift into a vantage point that is the more of the true person, so that and how difficult it is. I mean, David, you talked about, you can hear the rage in my voice as you went off around Trump and all of that stuff, which I could have duplicated probably even more vehemently than you, I'm sure. Right now, I'm in Thich Nhat Hanh land, and I'm hearing the message and not forgetting, and so I think that we are a far cry from realizing our true person, each one of us, and I think it's that's our duty. Talk about we just did an article, by the way. I did with Ram Dass that on Be Here Now. This podcast, I didn't even realize this, but we have a monthly theme. Our theme this month is inner and outer social action, and that was an article that we put out that's on ramdas.org on the homepage. You can check that out. It's pretty great. And certainly, just to revolve back to the reality of this is the first contribution we can make, and and again, this is not about the liberal side or the conservative side. This is about the reactions that happen in each one of us that prevent us from being our true person. And so first step is realizing that. And I did you read this one thing from him called Seeds of Our Ancestors? That was really far out.
Incredible.
Yeah.
He says, on a cellular level, we are still with our ancestors, and we're exhibiting their rage. And if we heal by whatever practice works, you're also healing them. And that's very, very hard to get your head around, but it's wonderful thought.
Amazing thought, really.
I hadn't come across that thought ever, honestly. When I read that, Raghu,
the Chinese do, and actually a shaman that I have done a couple of great podcasts with from South Africa, John Locklear.
Oh, yeah.
I remember. Yeah, we did one with him, you and I. Yeah, and then I did another one. Yeah, his practice is very much involved with ancestors. So, here he says, sometimes we act without intention, but that is also action. Habit energy is pushing us.
Yeah.
It pushes us to do things without our being aware. Sometimes we do something without knowing we're doing it. Even when we don't want to do something, we still do it. Sometimes we say, I didn't want to do it, but it's stronger than me. It pushed me. So that is a seed, a habit energy that may have come from many generations in the past. That's a scary-ass thought, actually.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I mean, I don't know how many times I've said, I've said it to you probably 1 billion times because we've spent so much time together, but remember I've said, this anger that I've got, it just comes from my father. Because he used to come home, he was like an angry dude. And every night he'd come home and he'd slam the table, and it was like an earthquake happened, and we all shook for minutes after it. And so forever after, that was it. Oh, God, I got this from Dad. And part of that is not taking any responsibility for me taking the appropriate actions to deal with this emotion. And then I read this thing and I'm going, holy shit. Maybe it came from all the way back. God knows, how far. So that's an interesting thing, and for people to realize. And here's within all of this, under this little. By the way, this whole thing is. Where did you find it? You found it in Shambhala?
It was in the last edition of Shambhala Sun before it turned into Lion's Roar. It's the very last one. I believe it's January 2016. And what it is a sort of a compilation of
Excerpts from his books,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, right. And it's a wonderful primer if you haven't read any of his work, or even if you have. And some of the things are just so incredibly wise. I wanted to mention he talks about the wounded child inside.
Yeah, no, very
And
good, because that's
ah,
alongside of these seeds that we come in with. I think,
yes.
yeah, go ahead.
Well,
That's excellent.
I mean, just, my take on it was that a lot of our anger about Trump or any of those people who are in power and seem to be completely callous people, a lot of that actually doesn't come from anger about their actions, but it comes from our own anger. And a lot of that comes from our wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And our wounds come from our childhood frequently, if not from our ancestors, certainly from our childhood. And very few people have not got them in various degrees into real abuse to just sort of neglect or various nuances of that. And he talks about looking at that wounded child and healing that child in ourselves. And, I went to a marvelous psychologist about 20 years ago, whose name I've temporarily forgotten. He was Russian. Peter, oh my God, I'll have to look it up. And he said, not only do you look at the wounded child, but he gave you a geographical perspective. He said, being a slight flight, as if you were a butterfly or a bird above that small child, and look at that small child as you remember yourself to be, and say to that small child, it's okay. It's okay. Have no fear. Yes, you were scared by those boys, those bullies. Yes, whatever it was. Or, if you're a young girl, just the fears that young girls have. Look back on your young girlhood or boyhood and just be above it, sort of like a ghost, if you like, a beautiful ghost, an angel, and look back on your own childhood, on that specific child. Try to remember what you looked like and say to the child, it's all right. It's all right. All these years later, it's all right. And at first I thought, wow, this is really dreamy stuff. But then I realized that it is all a drama within you. It's a movie that's playing, and you might as well redirect it,
Well,
recut it.
yeah, I mean, actually, he reiterated what you just said around how to deal with these, deep, deep, deep wounds. Once we
Yes.
recognized our inner child, the second function of mindfulness is to embrace him or her. This is a very pleasant practice. Instead of fighting our emotions, we are taking good care of ourselves. Mindfulness brings with her an ally, concentration. Okay, that's got to be way up there at the very top of things that we have to practice. Concentration means being able to not get lost in thought during a meditation, and then that comes into day-to-day life where your discursive patterns are not pulling you away from what is at hand that you're dealing with in the moment. Instead of mindfulness brings with her an ally, concentration. The first few minutes of recognizing and embracing our inner child with tenderness will bring some relief. You just said that in a different way, but exactly the same thing. The difficult emotions will still be there, but we won't suffer as much anymore, and they will lessen their grip on us. So these are, so when you and I talk and we say, wow, okay, this sounds like it's great, but it seems like we're pretty far away because of the way we're constantly knee-jerk reacting and living in a very angry state regarding all of these happenings. These are the kinds of things that every one of us needs to do, needs to identify that wounded place inside of us, that everybody has that. It needs to identify the seeds, whether they be from generations or seeds from an early part of your childhood that created an affinity to these particular reactions. So the identification of these things is extraordinarily important. And then, of course, the actual practice of mindfulness, which is pretty universal term now. You and I have discussed that and how it is being commercialized and so on and so forth. But in reality, the actual practice of meditation and awareness, or Ram Dass calls witness, and the re-identification of yourself with out of your mind into your intuitive spiritual heart, if you want to call it that, those are the actions that we can take, both on a psychological level with the wounded stuff inside, and then on a spiritual level where we actually do the practice necessary, like concentration and so on and so forth. So it's a real prescription that he really has given through his books, I would say. The other thing he talks about, Dave, that's really great, that I loved, that I never heard this term before, the businessless person. Did you read that thing?
I did, yes. He says the person that does nothing, holds the universe in their heart. I mean, he doesn't say it quite like that, but I understand it, that we're so driven, aren't we, by achievement. And actually the society, not just our society, but all, sort of organized societies say, you got to do something with your life. And yes, one can understand that phrase, but what? And very rarely does a government or even a school say, well, what you can do with your life is you either, learn how to, make a driverless car, or you learn how to do great solar panels, or you do whatever, or you don't do any of that, and you just concentrate on the enormous industry of healing your own wounds.
Well,
and observing,
Wait a minute now. This business-like person can be inventing a driverless car and be completely in the moment and not thinking he's got to do something else, that his wife is going to cook dinner, if his daughter's... No discursive thought. I mean, that's, that is the highest state possible, but one can be engaged in work. This, by the way, I got from Kalu Rinpoche a long time ago about you can become realized while doing work. You do not need to go into a cave and so on. But in this businessless person, with the idea that there's nothing to do and nowhere to go, let me tell you a story. Just recently, and this has happened in the last month or something, I as you know, I a couple of years ago met this Baba, a jungle Baba, who I've seen a number of times when I've gone to India. And so a couple other people kind of latched on and heard about it and said, gee, I'd like to go. I've talked about him in terms of being a very free being. I don't know his state of realization because I'm not that, but certainly free in the sense of no attachments and so on. So he said, my friend said, I'd like to go there. So I basically, he did get over to India, actually with his girlfriend. He did manage to get to see him. And he came back home, and this is, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of India. In this case, it was in the middle of the Rajasthan desert. And so I said, so what did you think? What was your impression of this being? You know what he said? He said, the biggest thing I got was he never had anywhere to go. He wasn't doing anything. He didn't, even for me, although this guy's a high-end programmer, right? A very engaged guy, with a brilliant mind. He said, even though I had gotten rid of most of the crap that I hold on to in the States about my job, my kids, my this, that, and the other, most of that had gone, because when you go to India, that stuff does fall away. You're so far away. You're in a completely different environment. He said, but while I was sitting there, I was going, shit, wonder if my shoes are going to be stolen. They're kind of nice. And when you see all the other shoes, they aren't so nice. I wonder what are they going to do for lunch? I'm not sure I can handle all the kind of Indian, he said my mind was skipping from one place to another, and I was moving about as each thought came, and I would act out on it. I could see in this being, he was not acting out on any level, coming or going. Nothing to do and nowhere to go. And I read this thing and I went, yeah, that's a perfect example of an ideal person, which they called back then, by the way, the arhat, someone who practiced attaining enlightenment. According to his master Linji, the businessless person is someone who doesn't run after enlightenment or grasp at anything, even if that thing is the Buddha. This person has simply stopped. She is no longer caught by anything, even theories or teachings. The businessless like person is the true person inside each one of us. The businessless person. That is a fantastic, and I love that analogy so much. So, and again, these are things, so humans are enacting this right now. Thich Nhat Hanh is not, this is not intellectual stuff. He comes from that place. And this Baba in India, the same thing. He is coming from that place. Both of them, by the way, have done a ton of practice. I mean, right. In caves forever, this, and Thich Nhat Hanh, from an early age was in the monastery and so on. Now, I think I want to suggest one other thing, because we return to very apocalyptic attitude from time to time, because it does seem like that. I mean, the environment and the wars and the discrepancy and the polarization. You go on, and it certainly has reached a very, very critical point, it seems, in history. I think we have to introduce, and what I love about Thich Nhat Hanh is he introduces a positive encounter with what the future can be. And that was this little part, a future is possible. And I don't think it's too naive when he says, when we see people living mindfully, smiling, and behaving in a loving manner, we gain confidence in our future. So isn't that another action, social action, when you talk about taking an action within ourselves to find out who we truly are, to realize some of the impediments through our wounded natures and deal with them, to do the kind of practices that give us a one-pointedness so that we are able to be mindful, that these things are an action that we can take so that by the process of becoming more who we truly are, there is a chance for there to be more and more people who reverberate off of that that nature that you've managed to cultivate. And I think that's a key thing. That's where Ram Dass has talked about social action starts heart to heart to heart to heart. So I think that's an incredibly important thing, and because I do think realizing that does give hope, does it not?
It does. There is a dialectic involved, though, because I know a relative of mine was highly critical of my Buddhist inclinations recently, and said, well, that's great, you're going to improve yourself, it's all great and everything, but are you going to change the politics? Are you going to change the structure of society? Are you going to change the infrastructure? You're going to fight against Citizens United? You're going to fight against the militarization of the planet? Or are you going to meditate? And what Raghu just said is an answer to that, but I was a little bit, it just showed how backward I am, because I got angry and said, that's nonsense. That's what I said to him. I said, that's just nonsense. I can't even get into it with you. It's such crap. And he said, well, why? My perception of Buddhists and so forth, mystics, is that they get very high and they reach levels of enlightenment. But what the hell good is that to someone who's suffering real bad stuff, has cancer, but there's no health care, is in a killing field in Afghanistan, etc.
Yeah.
And so my response to that was, well, to act from rage is never good. And it seems to me that many of the people I know who are activists are angry all the time. And that doesn't really work. It really doesn't. I mean, people say, okay, the protests, the angry protests at the Chicago Convention and Democratic Convention 1968 helped end the war. No, they didn't. It was 5 years before the peace accords were signed. So nothing immediate happened after those violent protests. And I'm all for people resisting and protesting, particularly this group of miscreants who've stolen this country at this time. But I'm of the opinion, but looking at my own anger, that it has never served any good purpose except maybe to motivate me to do something. But in itself, that is a conversion or a transformation from anger to motivation to action. And if it's coming from our teacher Ramdas's wisdom, deep wisdom, that it's heart to heart to heart, then it does stand a chance of working. It really does. And I believe that many of these doctors working in terrible places around the world to help people who are suffering with no health care whatsoever, that these are saintly people and wonderful people, and they're not usually that angry. I'll tell you something else. Ex-military people that I've met are usually not full of rage and anger because they've seen things that other people just theorize about. You know, many of the people, I've had friends who were in the military, and quite a few of them are quite equanimous. Not immediately, but after having experienced what they experienced, they saw the real deal here. And many of them are very calm and can see the world from a place of not anger, but just this is the way the world is. How enlightened they are is questionable. You don't know that about another person. But, you know, it all gets down to this thing of how effective can you be in ameliorating the condition of the planet and still maintain a stillness and a love. Because basically the undercurrent, the subtext of oneness means that all is one and you're part of it, and so is Donald Trump and Rick Perry and Betty DeVos and the rest of them, Betsy DeVos. We're all one. We can't just sort of accept them and say, well, you know, Melania Trump's not in my oneness. It just doesn't make any sense. So at that point, you realize that we're all complicit, if you like. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, you can say, well, we're all liberals and we're great and we've never done any harm to anybody. But actually, I mean, I was stuck on a highway 2 days ago in traffic that did not move on my lane, but moved in the lane next to me. So I was capable of sitting there silently and watching the lane next to me. And they were all gigantic trucks. It was a Deegan, the horrendous Deegan highway. Expressway, whatever they call it. It's none of those things. It's the slow way. And I'm looking into the eyes of the drivers of the trucks. I'm seeing fatigue and all kinds of alienation, actually. And these trucks roll into our cities and into our villages and towns every day by the million, and people are doing that. That's what they do, and we expect it. In other words, when I order my fiber powder from Amazon, it gets here in 3 days. Why does it get here in 3 days? Because of these working people. That's why. It doesn't come by osmosis. It doesn't come by divine fiat. It comes from hardworking people driving these trucks and working hard in a way that I've never worked. So my compassion for those people was increased on that highway. I looked at them and I thought, no wonder they voted for Trump.
Well, wait a minute. That's going too far.
No, I don't think it is, because they. I think most working class people were more attracted to him than, shall we say, upper middle class people, because they saw a stasis in the society where nothing was improving. Their wages were less than they were in 1982, and the cost of living is 4 times higher. That causes people to be pissed. You can't really expect people to be happy under Obama if nothing changed. I've got nothing against Barack Obama. He seems like a gracious gentleman to me. But what really changed for these truck drivers? They lost their jobs, most of them. So that's where my compassion fits in, you know, that I feel that a lot of the people voted for Trump, we can call them ignorant, we can call them narrow-minded, xenophobic, faux Christians, whatever we want to call them. But they voted for a reason. They didn't just vote out of hatred for me and East Coasters and people who live in Los Angeles. They voted because they were discontented and they were suffering to some extent. Foreclosures, no health care. Now, I think they voted for the wrong dude. And he talks about bad hombre. He's like the ultimate bad fucking hombre. But one has to reach into their hearts. One has to, and say, why did they do this? And the reason they did it was because they're looking at a society that was not particularly benign to them. And, there's a lot of ignorance in there. We know that. But there's also a lot of ignorance on our part when we believe in people who are really just sort of, two-dimensional figures on Anderson Cooper's show, who seem to be saying the right things. But their shirts are certainly new and starched. And their suits are certainly finely sewn. And their hair is done by stylists. And they're happy little campers. Do they really care about someone in Wisconsin who lost their job 10 years ago and now does handyman work for $5 an hour and can't afford to pay any health care costs or anything? I mean, that's why they hated Hillary Clinton, for God's sake. They couldn't identify with this woman who was getting $250,000 a lecture. I've got nothing against her, but I understand why they didn't like her. She was a fucking terrible candidate. Was Franklin Delano Roosevelt so far? He was a massive millionaire, an aristocrat, an autocrat with God knows how much property and how much money. But he got through to those people in 1933. And he changed the world. He changed the world. He made all kinds of work projects that helped those people, took them out of the Depression. He did do those things. And he felt for people, even though he was an aristocrat. And I think that goes back to Ramdas's heart to heart to heart. I think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a heart.
Okay,
and,
here's
so that's the end of my rant. There'll be many more in the next few years if I live.
But I do want to go back to the heart to heart thing, because we're talking about the potential possibilities that are there if that heart to heart does take place. Heart to heart to heart.
It's a good job you're here, Raghu, or else this would be this would I'd turn into the worst person anyone could.
I want to jump in there with you. I mean, it's taking everything not to just jump in there and go crazy too, but actually because I printed out one of these. David sent me these articles because I didn't have them, and they had a beautiful picture of Thich Nhat Hanh on one of them, and I've got it right in front of me. So whenever I get tugged into a place where I want to just go pillage and rape, I get drawn back.
Oh, he's not that violent. Come on, I want to speak for Raghu Marcus here. He puts himself down. He's helped enormous numbers of people. And he's very kind. Very kind person. So.
Oh, thank you. There's a lot of suffering in the world, and it's important for us to stay in touch with this suffering, which we are certainly managing to do in this podcast, in order to be compassionate. But to remain strong, we also need to embrace the positive elements. I think this is the next great key in terms of a panacea for what we're talking about. That has to happen. When we see a group of people living mindfully, smiling and behaving in a loving manner, we gain confidence in our future. Heart to heart to heart. When we practice mindful breathing, smiling, I love it includes smiling. Who includes smiling? Isn't it true, though? When you walk down the street, if you smile, usually someone will smile back at you, And
Raghu, he even says in your meditation, you close your eyes, you sit comfortably, and you put a slight smile on your face because it works as a machine within your consciousness.
Wow.
He says it in one of these pieces. Yeah. I loved it.
Smiling, resting, walking, and working, we become a positive element in society. And we will inspire confidence in everyone around us. This is the way to avoid allowing despair to overwhelm us. It is also the way to help the younger generation so they don't lose hope. It's very important we live our daily lives in such a way as to demonstrate that a future is possible. And boy, that is definitely a key to where we are at right now in every which way but Sunday. So it's easy to become nihilistic, cynical, It's easy to point the finger at everyone that seems a ripe target. And boy, there's a lot of them ripe targets right now. And sometimes, like the person who said to you, what are you going to go? These Buddhists, they're going to go meditate somewhere. What's that going to do? Or, you're going to start trying, you're going to look at inside yourself and try and find that truer person who you really are. You're going to try and deal with your inner demons, deal with your wounded child. You're going to look at the seeds that have been sown. You're going to look at all that, and then you're going to take action through different practices, meditative practices and mindful practices, and then everything's going to be okay. I mean, it's easy to fall into that. Meanwhile, what are you doing? You're not doing anything. You're not, where's the revolution? Where's the resistance, right? That's a whole other thing we got going on today, the resistance. The resistance better have some of these elements in it, or we're just going to have a bunch of angry people against another bunch of angry people, and nothing going to happen. So it is easy to fall back into this place. And even say to I can hear us saying to ourselves at times that we are naive to think that this heart to heart to heart to heart, this redefining of who we are and then radiating that is going to have an effect. It's difficult, and I think that's part of suffering. And I really there's another thing, Dave, that I didn't mention to you, and I know that you also he wrote a great book around anger, Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things. To be happy to me is to suffer less. If we were not capable of transforming the pain within ourselves, happiness would not be possible. Many people look for happiness outside themselves, but true happiness comes from inside. Our culture tells us happiness comes from having a lot of money, power, and high position. But if you observe carefully, you see that many rich and famous people are not happy. The most basic condition for happiness is freedom. Here we do not mean political freedom, but freedom from the mental formations of anger, despair, and delusion. Okay? In order to be free, we have to practice. We cannot ask Buddha, Jesus, God, or Muhammad to take anger out of our hearts for us. There are concrete instructions on how to transform the craving, anger, and confusion within us. If we follow these instructions and learn to take good care of our suffering, we can help others do the same. So he is constantly moving us back into the internal investigation, and then doing the practices that re-identify and give us a new vantage point from which we can look at this very, very tough world. Sorry about my dogs, Dave. Do you hear them?
I do. I love them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I it's easy to get cynical, I think.
Yeah. Well, Facebook is a beautiful sort of akashic record of all the people who I know lots of people I really dearly love who've become enraged 5 times, 10 times a day on Facebook, against Trump and all of this. And I understand their anger, and I understand why they hate him. And they're basically coming from a good place. They want people to get health care. They want a humane government. But their own anger is after a while, I noticed myself getting very repulsed by it. I couldn't look at it because it felt so wrong. It's like someone said to me recently, they cannot watch Bill Maher. I like Bill Maher because I think he's quite courageous, actually. But the person said to me, he's too cynical. I cannot get behind that head. It bothers me because ultimately, where does it go? And you could say, well, if there was a terrific, wonderful, humane, Justin Trudeau situation in the United States, then Bill Maher wouldn't be cynical. He would be, I love the president. I don't know whether that's true, but it's complex, this stuff, because satire is a thing that points out iniquity and all kinds of wrongs. The question is, does it give you any food to nourish you, to transcend the anger? And on the whole, I don't think it does. Although humor can help.
No, definitely can help. But I think I agree with that person. I think, and I love Bill Maher too, and I do watch him time to time. But I do think that cynicism is ultimately can be a very destructive thing, because I have it in myself, and I watch it, and see how it's an easier way to go than to do the kinds of things we've talked about in this podcast, to get at the core of who we are and deal with the wounded stuff, and do the kind of practices that will bring us, transform all of that, and be able to be in a place where we can give, especially next generation, some hope about that possibility. And one of the last things, David, that I read, what you sent me, was his practice around inclusiveness, because I find that's the biggest problem that I have. I can't wrap my arms around thinking of the other half of this country that feels opposite to where you and I do, and many other people. And his practice around inclusiveness, I think that again, that's easy to be cynical about, but I think it's absolutely necessary. And he talks about the practice of inclusiveness is based on the practice of understanding, compassion, and love. When you practice looking deeply to understand suffering, the nectar of compassion will arise naturally in your heart. Loving kindness and compassion can continue to grow indefinitely, and with enough understanding and love, you can embrace and accept everything and everyone. Okay? Tall order. But again, do you want to just walk around being cynical? And do you want to just, laugh at people and call them ignorant or whatever it is? I mean, it's a dead end, I know it's a dead end, and I'm saying too that I'm having a hard time. So that's why if he says if we truly want to live in peace, safety, and security, we must create an opportunity for those on the other side to live this way as well. If we know how to allow the other side into our heart, if we have that intention, we not only suffer less right away, but we also increase our own chances of having peace and security. I mean, that's pretty... it makes all the sense in the world, does it not?
It does. I mean, it's funny. I read something yesterday about homelessness, and the writer, I think correctly, was saying that when Ronald Reagan's administration stopped all subsidizing of low-income housing, the increase in homelessness was huge, and it's been proven, and ergo hatred of Ronald Reagan ensues. And just a funny story. I was in Los Angeles one time, and it was 1980, God knows, 88 or something. And I was at the ABC building in Century City for a meeting. It was early on a Saturday morning, and it was a nothing meeting, a real nothing burger of a meeting, but I had it. And the ABC building has got huge numbers of steps going down into the sort of courtyard of Century City compound. And I was alone, and I walked out, and it was kind of Roman. It felt Roman, there's huge pillars. I think. So I'm walking down, and I see this gentleman walking towards me 100 steps down in a very loud brown sports jacket with a guy next to him in dark gray suit and sunglasses. And as they came nearer, I realized it was Mr. Reagan. And I just went through so much in those 70 steps that were left between, because we were walking directly at each other and there was no one else anywhere. And my intolerance of Reagan's policies was welling up in my head. But in my heart, I just saw this rather old man, large man actually, walking towards me. He's a large guy.
What was
Reagan.
after the presidency?
It was just after the presidency, yeah. But there was only one Secret Service person with him. And as he came up the steps, instead of avoiding me, he walked straight at me. And I guess he saw me as a young man, even though I was getting a little older at that point. And he looked at me and he said, "What do you think of this morning, young man?" Stopped. The Secret Service man stopped. And I said, "It's a beautiful morning, Los Angeles. It's sunny. It's not too hot." I went into detail. He watched me. And then he said, "Well, I think it's delightful. And nice to meet you. Have a great day. Have a great day." And he smiled at me, and he had a very contagious smile. My God, Ronnie Reagan was a very charming human being. So I had my 90 seconds with the President of the United States, just having left the presidency.
God.
And as I walked to my car and as he walked into the building, I had no hatred in me for him. It had been eradicated. Now, it's come back a million times, but heart to heart in that moment. I mean, I have a bit of a reputation for meeting these people. I met Nixon, I met Trump, I like them all. But I mean, seriously, I met the person. Now, on recollection, Reagan seems like a decent guy compared with what we're dealing with now. But I do remember that when he looked into my eyes, he was really looking into my eyes. Now, the question is whether he was suffering from some minor dementia at that point. I don't know, which is probably why.
Not just after the president. Well, who knows what's
we
real
don't
and
know.
what's not. But
I do remember being rather taken by him for a moment. And of course, I'm aware of the draconian policies he brought in and so forth. But it is true that when you look in a person's eyes and you're right next to them, you realize something you don't realize when you're abstractly hating them. And that is a lesson. That was a lesson for me. Equally so when I met Mr. Nixon. I met President Nixon twice, and he was very kind to me, as it so happens. And we had good communications between us. But, that doesn't take away. No, I know people are going to just say.
This is, I want to end this podcast on this note.
Get this guy up there.
No, the ending note is David Silver, besties with Reagan, Nixon, and Trump is a reality, okay? In the moment reality, but it's still a reality, okay? Absolutely.
A minute with him and Melania, and he was very gracious, actually. And I think he,
See?
I'm sorry, everybody.
So this is all just actually complete bullshit. David is really close to the center of the soul of these people, heart to heart. You did the heart to heart thing. Never mind, think about it.
I had no choice. I don't know whether I had gone out of my way to do it, but
it happened.
Our dear friend Danny tells a story where he was at a meeting or an event, and Reagan was at it, and he happened to sort of cross his path somewhere on the dais or something, and Danny said he didn't know quite what to say to him, and then Reagan looked at Danny and said, "Have you tried the cookies? They're really good." And we're all human beings in this, and some people do bad, nasty, horrible, despicable things to other people. But you just have to get over that in yourself. I mean, that's what Thich Nhat Hanh is brilliant about, and Richard Alpert. I mean, they really I'm sick of saying Ram Dass. I sound like a sycophant. I'm not, but I will say this: that Ram Dass taught me over the years, over and over and over and over again, to look inside and stop objectifying this anger and saying that anger is only about something that happened out there. I think what Raghu and I have been talking a lot about today is the fact that much of that anger is aimed at something that happened to you in a formative time that traumatized you in some way, and therefore you are angry, full stop, period. It doesn't matter if Jesus Christ was the president of the United States. You'd be angry at him. You'd say, why didn't you cut your hair, Jesus? It's bothering me.
On the other hand, I want to, since this is a PPS on this note, we absolutely, none of this means that while you are trying to straighten your heart out so that you can be effective and you can reflect an energy that is going to help change all of this, you still, whatever you can do to affect change, please. I mean, we all have to do something. We all, yes, resist if that's part of what you need to be doing right now. Joining whatever organizations there are, speaking to congressmen about your, how you see what is going on and how you see they represent us in whatever districts, and how they act needs to be a reflection of who we are and how we got them where they are. So yes, everything needs to go on in terms of action that's social action, social justice. But it can't go on. I guess that's what we're really saying. And Thich Nhat Hanh really points the way. It cannot go on without this internal investigation and transformation. So that's our story, and we're sticking to it, okay?
Yeah. I mean, if he can walk while bombs are falling and still remain, this advanced soul full of love and teachings and help.
Yeah.
If he can do that, we can do it, now, when we are, living in relative comfort. And hopefully that'll go on for all of us, but it may not. And so no matter what, his ability to be equanimous and full of loving kindness in a time when people were being detonated by bombs is the
living proof.
Living perspective, living proof.
Living proof. Yeah. And it's all possible for us, and we should have real hope and share that hope with the next generation that's going to really need to have positive reinforcement. Dave, thanks so much for coming, and this is and suggesting Thich Nhat Hanh, because you and I never did it when we started these podcasts, and since then I have not thought of. Boy, he has a lot of just the perfect teaching. So everybody out there, you'll go to BeHereNowNetwork.com and Mindrolling, and we will have a page up about this podcast when we do our show notes and all that, telling you what, surmising what we went through here. We will put up some of his most important books so that you can have a chance to... and you can probably, this is a great compilation. I bet if you wrote to what's now called Lion's Roar, so we should put something up about Lion's Roar, and I bet if you wrote to them, they might be able to, you might have to subscribe to get the full breadth of all the articles, and we certainly can't put them up, but there it is right there, yes. For those of you that are watching this on YouTube, otherwise we just put up the cover of the magazine Shambhala Sun, which is now called Lion's Roar, and we'll help. We'll do some research, because this is a way in which they pulled articles from different books, so it's really fabulous. And okay, Dave, we got to continue in our investigations about how to get rid of the rage.
Yeah. It's extraordinarily crucial to all of us. It really is. My God.
All right.
Well, thanks, Raghu.
Thank you, David. This is Mindrolling. We'll see you next week.